She had two rules when traveling alone: never accept drinks from strangers and always lock the suite door. But that night at the most expensive hotel in Manhattan, the door was already locked from the inside. And the man in her suite was not room service. When he turned slowly, the city lights illuminating half his face, sharp jawline and penetrating gaze, he said only 3 words that changed everything. "You're late. Hey, before you find out who this mysterious man is and what the hell he is doing in her suite, tell me where you are watching from right now. Comment down below because I want to know. And if you want to find out what happens when she closes that door, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell because this story is about to get way more intense. Trust me, now let us continue." She had planned that night with the precision of someone who leaves nothing to chance. The reservation confirmed weeks ago, the flight on time, and when the hotel doors opened before her, that Italian marble lobby and crystal chandeliers seemed to promise exactly what she needed. Peace, silence, and a king-size bed all to herself. The exhaustion weighed on her shoulders like an invisible cloak, every muscle in her body screaming for rest after months of relentless work, endless meetings, and a life that seemed to run at double speed without ever stopping to breathe. She did not want luxury for show. She wanted luxury for the promise of being invisible, of not being bothered, of simply existing without having to smile, agree, or perform for anyone. When the receptionist handed her the suite keycard with that trained professional smile, she felt a wave of relief wash through her chest, as if finally, she could let her guard down. But she did not know that at that exact moment, sliding the magnetic card into the private elevator, her life was about to derail in a way that not even the most absurd script in her tired mind could predict. The corridor on the 23rd floor was too quiet, almost oppressive, as if the world outside had been put on mute and every sound was muffled by layers of thick carpet and fabric-lined walls. Her rolling suitcase made a dull, rhythmic noise, and she could only hear her own breathing, controlled but slightly labored, because that suitcase was heavier than it should be, and her pride would not let her accept help from the bellhop. The suite door was discreet, elegant, with a golden number that gleamed under the soft light of the wall sconces, and when she touched the card to the sensor, the green click came accompanied by a small sigh of satisfaction that she did not even realize she had released. She pushed the door open with her hip, dragging the suitcase with one hand and holding her purse with the other, her eyes already anticipating the vision of the impeccable room. The blackout curtains she would close immediately, the bathtub that maybe, just maybe, she would have the energy to use. But when the door opened completely and she took the first step inside, the world seemed to freeze for a fraction of a second before exploding into complete and absolute chaos. There was a man there, not a hotel attendant, not someone in uniform arranging towels or restocking the minibar, but a man in a suit without a tie, the first buttons of his white shirt unbuttoned, standing before the panoramic window with a glass of something golden and expensive in his hand, looking at the city as if he owned it. The light from the metropolis outside created a backlight around him, making his silhouette both imposing and disturbingly real, as if he had stepped out of a cologne commercial and decided to invade her reality without asking permission. For one infinitesimal moment, her brain simply did not process the information, as if it were running a program that could not compute the absurd scene before her eyes. And then came the adrenaline, an electric shock that ran up her spine and made every nerve ending in her body scream danger, invasion, threat. She dropped the suitcase with a dull thud, her hand flying instinctively to the purse where her phone was buried between wallet, lipstick, and keys. But before she could even process whether she should scream, run, or call security, he turned around, slowly, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world, and when his face finally became visible under the soft light of the suite, something in her stomach plummeted in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He was handsome in a way that seemed almost unfair, as if someone had sculpted every angle of that face with the specific intention of causing impact, of being impossible to ignore. Strong jawline, dark eyes that seemed to read every thought before she even formulated them, and an expression that mixed surprise with something else, something she could not name, but that made her heart beat faster for completely wrong reasons. The air between them felt charged with something she could not identify, an electricity that crackled invisibly, making the spacious suite suddenly feel too small, too intimate, too dangerous. She wanted to speak. to demand answers, to assert her right to this space that she had paid for. But the words seemed to have evaporated from her vocabulary, leaving her standing there like an idiot, with her mouth half open and her pulse hammering in her ears. And then he spoke, his voice deep, controlled, with an almost imperceptible accent that suggested education at expensive European schools and board meetings in 3 different languages. "You are late," he said, and the statement was so absurd, so out of context, so completely insane considering that he was the intruder here, that for a second she thought she was having a lucid dream induced by extreme exhaustion. But the weight of the purse on her shoulder was too real, the texture of the carpet under her boots was too solid, and his scent, which had somehow already crossed the space between them, was definitely undeniably real. She opened her mouth, ready to demand answers, to scream for security, to do anything that a rational person would do upon finding a stranger in their hotel suite. But then he took a step toward her, just one, and something in the way he moved, confident but not threatening, as if he had every right to be there, made the words die in her throat. There was something in his eyes, an intensity that was not exactly hostile, but also not casual, as if he knew her from somewhere, as if this absurd situation made sense to him in a way she did not yet understand. "Sorry for the scare," he continued, his voice softening just a fraction, but there was an error with the reservation, or perhaps it was not an error at all. And it was in that moment, in that enigmatic phrase loaded with meanings she could not decipher, that she realized 2 things simultaneously and with absolute clarity. First, that he was not leaving any time soon, and second, that she was not sure she wanted him to. Her rational mind was screaming at her to call the front desk, to get this situation resolved immediately, to remove this impossibly attractive intruder from her space before something she could not take back happened. But another part of her, a part she did not recognize and was not entirely comfortable acknowledging, was curious, dangerously curious, about why he was here and why his presence made her skin feel too tight and her breath too shallow. She hated that part of herself in that moment, hated the weakness it represented, hated how easily her body betrayed her better judgment. He moved to the small bar area near the window, his movements fluid and assured, like someone who had done this dance 1,000 times in 1,000 different luxury suites around the world. He poured amber liquid into a second glass, not asking if she wanted it, simply assuming in that infuriating way that powerful men always assumed that their gestures would be accepted, welcomed even. The ice clinked against the crystal, a sound that seemed too loud in the tense silence that had settled between them, like a living thing, breathing and waiting. "You look like you need this more than I do," he said, extending the glass toward her without crossing the invisible line that separated them, respecting a boundary she had not consciously established, but that he seemed to understand instinctively. His hand was steady, no tremor, no uncertainty, just the calm assurance of someone who was used to being in control of every situation, every room, every conversation. She stared at the glass, at the way the light caught the liquid and made it glow like liquid gold, and for a moment she forgot why accepting a drink from a stranger in her hotel room was probably the worst idea she had ever had. Her mind was racing in frantic circles, trying to fit the pieces of a puzzle that seemed to have been deliberately scrambled. "Error with the reservation," he had said, but the way the words left his mouth, that tone too controlled, almost calculated, did not match the genuine confusion that should accompany such a mistake. She knew luxury hotels well enough to know that errors like this simply did not happen, not in establishments where each guest paid the equivalent of a month's salary, just for the privilege of sleeping between 1,000 thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets. Redundant systems, triple checks, managers who lost sleep over the possibility of a single slip-up. All of this existed precisely to prevent an exhausted woman from finding an inexplicably attractive stranger, drinking whiskey in the suite that should be hers alone. But there he was, solid and real, occupying the space with a presence that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room, and every instinct she had was at war with itself, half screaming danger, and half whispering something far more treacherous. She knew she should be afraid, she knew she should be angry, but what she actually felt was a curiosity so intense it bordered on reckless. "Who are you?" she finally managed to say, her voice coming out rougher than she intended, raspier, as if she had not used it in days instead of hours. The question hung in the air between them, simple but loaded with 1,000 other questions she did not know how to ask. He smiled then, just a slight curve of his lips that did not quite reach his eyes, a smile that spoke of secrets and complications, and a life lived in shadows that people like her were not supposed to see. "Does it matter?" he replied, which was not an answer at all, but somehow told her everything she needed to know. He was someone important, someone powerful, someone who was used to having his name recognized and his presence accommodated without question. The fact that she did not immediately know who he was seemed to amuse him, as if her ignorance was a refreshing change from whatever he usually encountered. She felt a flash of irritation at that amusement, at the presumption that his identity should be obvious, that she should be impressed or intimidated or both. "I paid for this suite," she said, and she was proud of how steady her voice came out, how she managed to inject steel into words that wanted to tremble. "This is my room, my space, and you need to leave." She expected him to argue, to make excuses, to pull out some explanation that would somehow justify this insane situation. Instead, he simply nodded, as if acknowledging a fair point, and took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers over the rim of the glass. "You are absolutely right," he said, and the agreement should have been reassuring but somehow made everything worse, because his tone suggested that being right was not going to change anything at all. He set the glass down on the bar with a soft clink, the sound final and somehow ominous. "But before I go, there is something you need to know about this suite, about this hotel, and about why you were never supposed to be here tonight." And with those words, the ground beneath her feet shifted, and she realized that whatever she had walked into was far more complicated than a simple booking error. The suite was not just a suite, he explained, his voice dropping to something quieter, more intimate, as if sharing a confidence that could get them both in trouble. It was a safe house, a place reserved for people who needed to disappear for a night, for reasons that ranged from business deals that could not happen in public, to personal situations that required absolute discretion. The hotel had an entire floor dedicated to this purpose, rooms that existed in the system, but were never advertised, never listed on any booking site, accessible only to those who knew the right people and had the right connections. She felt her eyebrows climb toward her hairline as she processed this information, her mind trying to reconcile the legitimate-looking reservation confirmation on her phone with this revelation that she had somehow stumbled into some kind of elite underground network. It sounded like the plot of a thriller novel, too absurd to be real, and yet the way he said it with such casual certainty made it impossible to dismiss as fiction. She wondered if she should be more alarmed than curious, but apparently her survival instincts had taken a vacation the moment she walked through that door. "So why am I here?" she asked, the question sharper than she intended, edged with suspicion and a growing sense that nothing about this night was going to make sense. If this floor is so exclusive, so secret, how did my perfectly normal reservation end up routing me to a room that should not exist? He tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she refused to give him that satisfaction, holding his gaze even as her pulse kicked up another notch. "That," he said slowly, "is the question I have been trying to answer for the last hour. Someone changed your reservation, rerouted it from the standard floor to this one, and that kind of override requires access that very few people have." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a flash of something that might have been anger or concern crossing his features, before he schooled them back into that careful neutrality. Which means either someone made a very expensive mistake, or someone wanted you here specifically. The implications of that statement hit her like cold water, washing away the last remnants of her exhaustion and replacing it with sharp, focused alertness. She set her purse down slowly on the console table near the door, her mind working through possibilities at lightning speed. "I do not know anyone who could or would do something like that," she said, hearing the defensive edge in her own voice. "I am nobody, just a marketing consultant traveling for work, staying at a nice hotel because my company has a corporate rate here. There is no reason anyone would go to this kind of trouble." But even as she said it, doubt crept in, because was that entirely true? In her line of work, she dealt with sensitive campaigns, with product launches worth millions, with information that competitors would pay handsomely to access early. She had always been careful, always professional, but had she been careful enough? Had someone been watching her, tracking her movements, waiting for an opportunity like this. The paranoia felt absurd, and yet standing in this secret suite with this mysterious man, nothing felt absurd anymore. Everything felt possible, and that possibility was terrifying in ways she was only beginning to understand. He moved away from the bar, prowling across the room with the restless energy of a caged predator, and she noticed for the first time the laptop open on the desk, multiple screens visible, lines of code or data, scrolling across them too fast for her to read. He had been working when she arrived, she realized, not just relaxing with whiskey and a view. Whatever brought him here tonight, it was serious. Important enough that he had commandeered one of these phantom suites for himself. "You said you are a marketing consultant," he said, but his tone suggested he already knew more about her than she had revealed. "Who are your current clients? What campaigns are you working on? And is there anything in your professional life that might make you valuable to someone?" The questions were rapid-fire, professional, and she found herself answering before she consciously decided to, listing her active accounts, the upcoming product launches, the influencer partnerships she was negotiating. With each answer, she watched his expression shift, watched him process and calculate, and she realized with a jolt that he was not just concerned, he was worried, and that worry transferred to her like a contagion. One of her current projects involved a tech company preparing to launch a revolutionary new device, something that would disrupt an entire industry if successful. The details were under strict NDA, the launch date was confidential, and only a handful of people knew the full scope of what was coming. She had been working on the campaign for 6 months, coordinating with teams across 3 continents, and the pressure had been immense, but she had thought the security was airtight. Now watching this stranger's face tighten with recognition when she mentioned the company name, she wondered if she had been catastrophically wrong. "That is why you are here," he said flatly, and there was no satisfaction in his voice, only grim confirmation. "Someone knows what you're working on, and they want to either stop it or steal it, and you just became the easiest entry point." She felt the blood drain from her face, her hands suddenly cold despite the warmth of the suite. This could not be happening. This kind of corporate espionage was something that happened to other people. In movies, not to her in a Manhattan hotel on a Tuesday night. But his eyes told her it was real, it was happening, and her perfectly planned peaceful night had just turned into something she did not have the training or experience to handle. She sank onto the edge of the plush sofa, without realizing she was moving, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. "You still have not told me who you are," she said, and this time it was not curiosity but necessity, because if she was in danger, if someone had manipulated her reservation to get to her, then she needed to know exactly who this man was, and why he seemed to understand the threat better than she did. He stood silhouetted against the window again, the city lights creating that same dramatic backlight, and for a long moment he did not speak, as if weighing how much to reveal. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a sleek business card, and crossed the space between them to hand it to her. His fingers brushed hers as she took it, a contact that lasted a fraction of a second too long, and she felt that electric jolt again, her body responding in ways her mind firmly told it not to. She looked down at the card, reading the name embossed in elegant script, and felt her world tilt sideways for the second time that night. Alexander Kingsley Chen, the card read, and beneath it, Chairman and CEO, Titan Global Enterprises. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. He was one of the youngest billionaires in the country, a man who had built a tech and investment empire from nothing by the time he was 30. His face had been on the cover of Forbes, of Time, of every business publication that mattered, and she had seen him speak at conferences, always from a distance, always surrounded by security and handlers and people far more important than her. And now he was standing in her hotel suite, or rather she was standing in his secret hotel suite, and the absurdity of the situation would have been funny if it were not so completely terrifying. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you can afford to buy this entire hotel, why are you hiding in a safe house suite?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications, and she watched something flicker across his face, something that looked almost like vulnerability, before he locked it down. "Because the people who want to stop your client's product launch are the same people who want me dead," he said simply, as if discussing the weather rather than assassination attempts. "Your tech company is about to release something that will make my primary competitor obsolete, cost them billions, and they have spent the last 6 months trying to either acquire the technology or ensure it never sees the light of day. I have been helping to fund and protect the project through back-channel investments, which makes me a target as much as the company itself. She stared at him, her mind struggling to process layer after layer of information that kept rewriting everything she thought she knew about her safe, boring marketing job. He moved back to his laptop, his fingers flying over the keys with practiced ease, and pulled up a series of photographs, news articles, incident reports. 3 attempts in the last month, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. 1 car brake failure that could have been an accident, 1 food poisoning incident that put me in the hospital for 2 days, and 1 very obvious break-in at my private residence while I was traveling. So yes, I am hiding, and yes, I am paranoid, and based on your presence in this suite tonight, I am not paranoid enough. She stood on shaking legs and moved to the laptop, looking at the evidence he had compiled, and with each image, each report, the reality of her situation became more undeniable. If they want you dead, she said slowly, and they think I have valuable information about the launch. Then her voice trailed off because she did not want to finish that sentence, did not want to give voice to the fear that was crystallizing in her chest like ice. Then they want you compromised, he finished for her, his tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. They want your passwords, your files, your access to the campaign servers, and they do not particularly care about your well-being in the process. Rerouting you to this suite was probably meant to isolate you, to make you vulnerable. But they could not have known I would be here tonight, which means we accidentally disrupted whatever they had planned. The thought that she had unwittingly walked into a trap, and that Alexander Chen's presence had somehow saved her from it, was both reassuring and absolutely horrifying. She wanted to laugh at the sheer impossibility of it all, but her throat felt too tight, and her eyes were stinging with tears she absolutely refused to shed in front of this man. "What do we do now?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded, how much the question revealed about how lost she felt. He closed the laptop with a decisive click and turned to face her fully, and in that moment she saw past the billionaire, past the polished exterior, to something harder and more dangerous underneath. "We stay here tonight," he said. "This suite is secure. It has better locks and security than anywhere else in the hotel, and whoever is watching will not expect you to stay put once you've found me here. Tomorrow we get you to my security team. We lock down your access, we change every password, and move every file to a secure server they cannot breach. And then we find out who is behind this, and we make them regret they ever looked in your direction." The fierce protectiveness in his voice surprised her, as if she had become his responsibility the moment she walked through that door. She should be afraid of him. She should be questioning his motives. But instead, she found herself trusting him with an instinct that defied logic, as if some part of her recognized him in a way that transcended reason and common sense. The suite suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, charged with a different kind of tension now that the immediate shock had worn off and reality settled in. They were going to spend the night here together alone, and while the circumstances were about survival and safety, her body seemed to have entirely different ideas about what that proximity meant. She watched him move around the space with easy familiarity, checking the door locks, adjusting the window blinds to obscure any view from outside, pulling his phone out to send rapid-fire texts to what she assumed were his security people. There was something mesmerizing about watching him work, about seeing the careful precision with which he assessed and secured their environment, as if he had done this before, as if danger was just another Tuesday for him. She wondered what it was like to live that way, to move through the world knowing that people actively wished you harm, to have enough money and power that you became a target just by existing. It sounded exhausting, and looking at the tension in his shoulders, the brackets around his mouth that spoke of stress and too little sleep, she thought maybe it was. "You should eat something," he said without looking at her, breaking into her thoughts with startling abruptness. "When was the last time you ate?" She opened her mouth to say she was fine, then realized she could not actually remember her last meal. The day had been such a blur of meetings and airports and travel anxiety. "Hours ago," she admitted, and immediately her stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, betraying her attempted nonchalance. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and far less intimidating, and she felt her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He picked up the room phone and ordered from room service without asking what she wanted, rattling off a series of dishes that sounded expensive and delicious, and she was too tired and too hungry to protest his high-handedness. When he hung up, he shed his jacket, draping it over the back of a chair, and rolled up his shirt sleeves, exposing forearms that her eyes absolutely should not be lingering on, but somehow were. "Focus," she told herself sternly. "This is not a date. This is a hostage situation, except you are both hostages, and also maybe the people trying to keep each other alive, and it is all incredibly confusing." The food arrived faster than she expected, wheeled in on a silver cart by a server who never made eye contact, and left with almost comical speed after Alexander tipped him. They ate in relative silence, sitting at opposite ends of the sofa, the coffee table between them laden with plates of gourmet food that tasted like heaven after the long day. She caught herself watching him between bites, noting the way he ate with focused efficiency, the way his jaw worked when he chewed, the way his fingers gripped the fork with an odd kind of grace. "Stop it," she commanded her traitorous brain. "This is not the time for whatever this is." But her body was not listening, hyper-aware of every movement he made, every breath, every small sound, as if all her senses had suddenly been dialed up to maximum sensitivity. She blamed the adrenaline, the shock, the fact that she had been alone for too long and he was objectively the most attractive man she had ever shared a confined space with. But none of those explanations made the awareness any less potent or any less inappropriate given their circumstances. After dinner, the exhaustion hit her like a physical wave, crashing over her with such intensity that she swayed where she sat. "You need to sleep," he said gently. And she wanted to argue, but her eyes were already closing against her will. "Take the bed. I will stay out here and keep watch." She should have argued with that too. Should have insisted on some kind of fair division of sleeping arrangements, but the bed visible through the open bedroom door looked like paradise, and her body was staging a full-scale rebellion against any further consciousness. She stumbled toward the bedroom, vaguely aware of him moving around the suite behind her, the soft sounds of him settling into what she assumed would be an uncomfortable night on the sofa. She kicked off her boots, stripped down to her underwear and tank top with efficiency born of exhaustion, and crawled between the sheets that felt like clouds, like safety, like a brief reprieve from a nightmare she still was not entirely sure was real. Sleep claimed her almost immediately, pulling her under into darkness that should have been peaceful, but was instead filled with fragmented dreams of danger and dark eyes and a voice that promised protection she was not sure she deserved. She woke to darkness and the sense that something was wrong, her heart pounding before her eyes even opened. The suite was silent, too silent, and for a disorienting moment she could not remember where she was or why her muscles felt like they had been locked in tension for hours. Then it came back in a rush, the strange man in her suite, the revelation about the threat Alexander Kingsley Chen and his matter-of-fact discussion of assassination attempts as if they were minor inconveniences. She sat up slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering in from the living area, where he had left a single lamp burning, and through the open door she could see his silhouette still on the sofa, his laptop screen casting a blue glow across his features. He was awake, working, and she wondered if he had slept at all or if he had spent the entire night standing guard while she was unconscious and vulnerable. Something about that image, about his unwavering vigilance, made her chest tight with an emotion she did not want to examine too closely. She should go back to sleep, should take advantage of whatever hours remained before dawn, but instead she found herself slipping out of bed and padding silently across the carpet toward him, drawn by something she could not name, and was not entirely sure she wanted to resist. He looked up as she approached, no surprise in his expression, as if he had been aware of her the entire time, as if his attention had been split between the screen and monitoring her breathing in the next room. "Could not sleep?" he asked, his voice low and rough with fatigue. She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself, suddenly very aware that she was standing in front of a billionaire in her underwear and a thin tank top. But he kept his eyes carefully on her face, respectful in a way that somehow made the situation more intimate, rather than less. "I kept dreaming," she admitted, though she did not elaborate on the content of those dreams, on the way his face had featured in them, in ways that had nothing to do with corporate espionage and everything to do with other kinds of danger. He gestured to the space beside him on the sofa, and she sat, maintaining a careful distance, even as every atom of her being seemed to want to close that gap. They sat in the darkness together, the city sprawling below them through the window, and the silence between them felt heavy with all the things neither of them were saying. "You did not have to stay awake all night," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper in the quiet. "You could have woken me. We could have taken shifts." He smiled slightly, a sad edge to the curve of his mouth. "I do not sleep much anyway," he said. "When you live the way I do, sleep feels like vulnerability, like giving someone an opportunity you cannot afford to give." She heard the loneliness in that statement, the isolation that came with being perpetually on guard, and she felt a sharp pang of sympathy for this man who had everything money could buy except apparently peace. "That sounds like a terrible way to live," she said honestly. He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and she saw something shift in his expression, a crack in the careful armor he wore. "It is," he agreed, and the simplicity of that admission felt like trust, like a gift he was giving her by being honest instead of deflecting. She wanted to ask what it would take to change that, what it would take for him to feel safe, but she suspected the answer was nothing, that he had passed some point of no return where safety was no longer possible, and all that remained was management of risk. "Tell me something about you that is not related to work or danger or any of this mess," she said, surprising herself with the request. "I want to know who you are when you are not being Alexander Kingsley Chen, billionaire target." He laughed, a short sound that was more exhale than humor. "I'm not sure that person exists anymore," he said. "I have been building this empire for so long, playing this game, that I do not remember what I wanted before I wanted everything." But he paused, thinking, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened with something that might have been nostalgia. "I used to paint," he said. "In college, before everything exploded, before I dropped out to start my first company, I used to spend hours in the art studio, just losing myself in color and form, and the feeling of creating something with my hands." She tried to imagine him like that, younger, less hardened, covered in paint and focused on beauty instead of market dominance, and the image was so at odds with the man beside her that it felt like hearing about a completely different person. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Every day," he said, and the raw honesty in those two words made her throat tight. "What about you?" he asked, turning the tables. "Who are you when you are not being a marketing consultant, accidentally caught in corporate espionage?" She smiled despite everything. "I write," she said. "Not professionally, just for myself. Stories, mostly. Things I will never show anyone because they are too personal, too revealing. It is the one part of my life that is completely mine, where I do not have to perform or meet anyone's expectations or present a particular image. I can just be messy and honest and unfiltered." He nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant, as if he too had those parts of himself that he kept locked away from public view. "What do you write about?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, grateful for the darkness that hid her blush. "Everything," she said, which was not quite a lie but also not the complete truth, because she was not about to admit that she wrote romance, that she spent her free time crafting stories about impossible love and dangerous men and situations, exactly like the one she currently found herself in. Except in her stories, there were never real consequences, only passionate resolution. The universe, she thought, had a twisted sense of humor. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing with surprising ease, considering they were basically strangers thrown together by circumstances neither had chosen. He told her about growing up poor, about the drive that had pushed him to succeed, about the first company he had built and sold for millions when he was barely 25. She told him about her small-town upbringing, about her parents who did not quite understand her career, about the constant imposter syndrome that made her feel like she was always one mistake away from being exposed as a fraud who did not belong in the world she had worked so hard to enter. With each story, each revelation, the space between them on the sofa seemed to shrink incrementally, until she realized her shoulder was nearly touching his, until she could feel the heat radiating from his body, until the air between them felt charged with something that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with a different kind of risk. She knew she should pull back. should maintain professional distance. But she was tired of being professional, tired of being careful. And the way he was looking at her made her feel reckless in ways she had not felt in years. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky beyond the window in shades of pink and gold, and she realized they had talked through the entire night without either of them noticing the passage of time. The light caught his face, highlighting the sharp planes and the shadow of stubble darkening his jaw, and she found herself staring, memorizing, as if this moment was something she would need to hold on to later, when reality reasserted itself, and whatever this was between them evaporated like morning fog. He was watching her too, she realized, his gaze moving over her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. As if he was engaged in the same process of memorization, as if he too sensed that they were existing in a bubble that would inevitably burst. "I should let you get ready," he said, but he made no move to stand, to break the spell that had woven itself around them in the darkness and now held them suspended in the dawn light. She knew he was right, knew they needed to start making plans, contacting his security, figuring out next steps, but she could not make herself move either, could not make herself end this strange intimacy that had developed between them over the course of one impossible night. "What happens now?" she asked, and she was not entirely sure if she was asking about the security situation or about whatever was happening between them. This connection that felt too real and too intense to be explained by circumstance alone. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, his hand cupped her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone in a touch so gentle it made her want to cry. "I do not know," he admitted, and the uncertainty in his voice somehow made him more real, more human, less like the untouchable billionaire from magazine covers. "I know what I should do, what is smart and safe and professional, but since when has any of this been about what should happen?" She leaned into his touch without thinking, her eyes closing briefly, and when she opened them again, he was closer. So much closer that she could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, could count his eyelashes, could feel his breath against her lips. "This is a terrible idea," she whispered, but her hands were already moving to his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath the thin fabric of his shirt, feeling his heart pounding as hard and fast as her own. The worst, he agreed, but he was already closing the distance between them, and when his lips touched hers, it was not gentle or tentative, but hungry, desperate, like he had been holding himself back all night, and his control had finally shattered. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer as if she could merge them into one person and solve the problem of separation entirely. The world narrowed to sensation, to the taste of him, to the way his hands moved over her body with a confidence that should have alarmed her, but instead made her feel worshipped, desired in a way she had never experienced before. He pulled her into his lap without breaking the kiss, and she went willingly, straddling him, feeling the evidence of his desire pressing against her core through the thin layers of fabric between them. This was insanity, she thought distantly. This was moving too fast. She barely knew him, but her body was screaming that she knew him in all the ways that mattered, that this connection was real even if it defied logic. And for once in her careful, controlled life, she decided to listen to her body instead of her brain. He broke the kiss first, resting his forehead against hers, both of them breathing hard, and she could see the war happening behind his eyes, desire battling with responsibility, with the knowledge that he was supposed to be protecting her, not seducing her. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice wrecked. And she knew he meant it, knew that if she said the word he would respect it even if it killed him. But she did not want him to stop. She wanted him to keep going, wanted to feel something other than fear and uncertainty, wanted to take back some control in a situation where she had felt powerless. "Do not stop," she said clearly, holding his gaze so there could be no misunderstanding. "I am a grown woman making a choice, and I choose this, I choose you, at least for right now." She saw relief and hunger flash across his face in equal measure, and then his mouth was on hers again, his hands sliding under her tank top, and she stopped thinking entirely, surrendering to sensation, to this moment, to this man who had somehow become essential to her in the space of a single night. He carried her to the bedroom, and she wrapped her legs around his waist, trusting him to navigate, while her mouth explored the column of his throat, tasting salt and something uniquely him that she could not name but wanted more of. He laid her on the bed with surprising gentleness, given the urgency thrumming through both of them. And she watched as he straightened, as he pulled his shirt over his head in one fluid motion, revealing a body that was all lean muscle and controlled power, the body of someone who worked out for functionality rather than vanity. There were scars, she noticed, faint white lines across his ribs, across his shoulder, evidence of a life lived dangerously, and she wanted to know the story of each one, but that could come later. Right now, she just wanted to touch, to explore, to map this unexpected terrain that had become hers to discover. He came down over her, caging her with his arms but not his weight, still careful even in passion. And she found that carefulness endearing, appreciated the way he was trying to maintain control when everything between them felt like it was spinning wildly out of control. She pulled him down, eliminating the distance, wanting to feel his weight, wanting to be overwhelmed by him, and he complied with a groan that vibrated through both of them. Clothes disappeared in a tangle of limbs and impatience, and then there was nothing between them but skin and heat and the kind of connection that she had only ever read about in books, but never quite believed was real. He paused at the edge of entering her, his eyes searching hers one more time, and she appreciated that he was giving her one last chance to change her mind, to back out, to be sensible. But sensible had never gotten her anywhere. This felt urgent and necessary, and she nodded, pulling him down into a kiss that was answer enough. When he finally pushed inside her, they both made sounds that were more primal than civilized, and she felt complete in a way that terrified her, even as it felt absolutely right. He moved slowly at first, giving her time to adjust, but she urged him faster, harder, wanting him to match the intensity of everything they had shared, everything they were risking. And when he complied, when he let go of his careful control and just moved with her, lost in the rhythm they created together, she felt something break open in her chest, something that had been locked away for too long, and she knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened next, she would never be the same person she was before she walked through that hotel room door. They lay tangled together afterward, hearts racing, skin damp with exertion, and she could not remember the last time she had felt this satiated, this perfectly exhausted in the best possible way. His arm was heavy across her waist, possessive even in the aftermath, and she found she liked it, liked the weight and warmth of him, the way his breath tickled the back of her neck where he had pressed his face into her hair. She should feel guilty, she thought, should be panicking about the fact that she had just slept with a man she met less than 12 hours ago. A man who was supposed to be helping her survive a corporate espionage situation, not seducing her or being seduced by her. But guilt was nowhere to be found, replaced instead by a bone-deep satisfaction and a feeling of rightness that defied all her usual careful analysis. She had made a choice, an informed choice, and she refused to regret it even if the consequences might be complicated. Life was short, and corporate assassins might be after her. And if she was going to die young, she at least wanted to go out having experienced passion that made every romance novel she had ever read seem pale by comparison. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his voice rough from things other than sleep, and she heard real concern in the question, a need to know that he had not hurt her, had not pushed her into something she did not want. She turned in his arms, facing him, and what she saw in his face made her chest tight, because he looked vulnerable in a way that a man of his power and reputation should never look, as if her answer mattered more than anything else in the world. "I am more than okay," she said honestly, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "That was—" She paused, searching for words adequate to describe what they had just shared. Incredible does not even begin to cover it. She watched relief wash over his features, watched tension she had not realized he was carrying drain away, and he caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that felt more intimate than anything they had just done. "Good," he said simply, and the single word held layers of meaning she was only beginning to unpack. Then he pulled her closer, tucking her head under his chin, and she felt safe in a way that should have been impossible given their circumstances, but somehow was not. They should have been making plans, calling his security team, figuring out how to handle the threat that had brought them together in the first place, but neither of them moved, both seemingly content to exist in this bubble of post-coital peace, for as long as reality would allow. She traced idle patterns on his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart beneath her palm, and wondered what came next. If this was a one-time thing born of extraordinary circumstances, or if it could possibly be the beginning of something more. The rational part of her brain said it was impossible. They came from different worlds. His life was dangerous and complicated, and she was just a normal woman who had stumbled into his orbit by accident. But the part of her that had come alive in his arms whispered that impossible things happened every day, that connection like this was rare enough to be worth fighting for, and maybe, just maybe, she deserved to take a chance on something that felt this monumental. She did not know which voice to listen to, so she decided to listen to neither, to just exist in this moment and let the future worry about itself. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, shattering the peace, and she felt him tense against her, felt him transform from the man who had been buried inside her to the billionaire magnate who had threats to manage and empires to run. He reached for it with obvious reluctance, and she caught a glimpse of the message before he could angle it away. Something about security protocols and threats assessed and time-sensitive action required. Reality, she thought, was a cold and unforgiving thing, and their brief escape from it was officially over. He set the phone down with a sigh that spoke of deep weariness, then turned to her with an expression that was part regret and part determination. "We need to move," he said gently. "My team has a secure location ready, and we need to get you there before whoever is behind this realizes we spent the night here instead of you being wherever they plan to grab you." She nodded, understanding even as disappointment curled in her stomach, because she had known this was coming, had known the moment could not last, but knowing did not make it easier to let go. They dressed in silence, the intimacy of the night giving way to the practicality of survival, and she found herself watching him, memorizing the way he moved, the way he buttoned his shirt with efficient precision, the way he ran his hands through his hair to tame it into something resembling professional. He caught her staring and smiled, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made him look younger, almost boyish, despite the gravity of their situation. "What?" he asked, and she shook her head, not trusting herself to put into words the tangle of emotions churning in her chest. "Nothing," she lied, and they both knew it was a lie, but he let it go, crossing to her instead and pulling her into his arms for a kiss that was both goodbye and promise, a kiss that said this was not over, even if they did not know what this was yet. When he pulled back, his hands cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones, and she saw everything she was feeling reflected in his eyes, the confusion and the certainty, the fear and the hope. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "I'm glad you walked through that door last night." "Me too," she whispered, and meant it with her whole heart, even knowing that glad might be the most complicated emotion she had ever experienced. His security team arrived exactly when he said they would, which should not have surprised her, given the level of precision with which Alexander seemed to run every aspect of his life, but still impressed her nonetheless. They were professional, discreet, moving through the suite with practiced efficiency, checking exits, examining the hallway beyond, communicating in low voices and hand signals that spoke of military training and serious expertise. She felt suddenly very aware that she was just a marketing consultant, way out of her depth, playing in a world of private security and corporate warfare where people died for real, not just in the abstract way death existed in normal life. One of the team members, a woman with sharp eyes and an air of competence that was almost intimidating, approached her with a tablet and began asking questions, logging her answers about her work, her access credentials, her recent activities, anything that might give them insight into who was behind the threat and what they wanted. Alexander stood nearby, not hovering exactly, but close enough that she felt his presence like an anchor, a reminder that she was not facing this alone even if it felt overwhelming. The plan, as they explained it, was elegantly simple in concept, even if she suspected the execution would be anything but. They would move her to one of Alexander's private properties, a penthouse in a different part of the city that had security measures in place that rivaled some government installations. She would stay there under protection while they worked to identify and neutralize the threat, which Alexander's head of security estimated would take anywhere from a few days to a couple of weeks, depending on how deep the conspiracy went. Her company would be told she was taking emergency personal leave due to a family situation, which was vague enough to be believable and would explain her sudden absence without raising alarms. Meanwhile, Her access to all the campaign materials would be suspended and transferred to a senior team member who could continue the work without her direct involvement, eliminating her value as a target. It all made sense. She could see the logic. But the reality of what they were describing, going into hiding, essentially disappearing from her life, felt surreal in a way she was still struggling to process. This morning, she had been a normal person with a normal life, and now she was in a situation that required witness protection level security. And the cognitive dissonance was making her head spin. "You will not be a prisoner," Alexander said quietly, reading the panic that must have been showing on her face. "You will have freedom within the penthouse, access to everything you need, and He paused, and she saw something uncertain flicker across his features. "I will be staying there as well, if that is okay with you, because they are after me too, and consolidating our security makes strategic sense." She heard what he was not saying, heard the question beneath the practical justification, and she appreciated that he was asking rather than assuming, that even after everything they had shared, he was giving her the choice. "Yes," she said simply, and watched relief soften his expression. The truth was, the idea of facing this without him felt impossible, not because she was weak, but because he had somehow become her partner in this insanity, and partners stuck together. The security team exchanged glances that suggested they were not fooled by the strategic sense justification, but they were too professional to comment, simply nodding and continuing with their preparations. They moved her out through a service exit, bypassing the main lobby entirely, and she found herself in the back of an SUV with tinted windows, so dark she could barely see out, Alexander beside her, and 2 security personnel in the front. The city streamed past outside, familiar and yet completely transformed now that she knew danger lurked in it, now that every car could potentially be a threat, every pedestrian potentially a hostile actor. She felt Alexander take her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and she squeezed back gratefully, needing the physical reminder that she was not alone in this. They did not talk during the drive, both lost in their own thoughts, processing everything that had happened in such a compressed time frame. She wondered what her life would look like on the other side of this, when the threat was neutralized, and she could theoretically return to normal, except she already knew normal was not an option anymore. You could not unknow what she now knew about corporate warfare, about the lengths powerful people would go to protect their interests. And you definitely could not unknow what it felt like to be with Alexander Kingsley Chen, to have him look at you like you were the only person in the world who mattered. The penthouse, when they arrived, was stunning in that understated way that screamed serious money. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city, modern furniture that was clearly designer, but somehow still looked comfortable and livable. The security team did a sweep, then one by one departed, leaving instructions and contact information and assurances that they would be monitoring remotely and were only minutes away if needed. And then it was just the 2 of them, standing in this beautiful space that would be their prison and sanctuary for however long this took, and the weight of what they were doing, of the choice they had made to face this together, settled over her like a physical thing. So Alexander said, his tone attempting lightness but not quite achieving it, "Welcome to our temporary home." She turned to look at him, this man who had gone from stranger to lover to protector in the span of less than 24 hours, and felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. "Thank you," she said, and the words encompassed so much more than gratitude for the shelter, thanking him for believing her, for keeping her safe for last night, for treating her like an equal partner rather than a victim to be managed. He crossed to her, pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, burying her face in his chest and breathing in the scent of him, letting herself have this moment of vulnerability before they had to figure out what came next. The first few days in the penthouse were strange, surreal, a bubble within a bubble where the normal rules of life seemed suspended. They established routines, small rituals that gave structure to the uncertainty, morning coffee together watching the sunrise, afternoon work sessions where she helped him with some of his less sensitive projects, and he taught her about the aspects of his business that were not corporate secrets, evenings cooking dinner together, because eating takeout every night felt depressing, and cooking felt like maintaining some semblance of normalcy. They talked constantly, learning each other in ways that people usually took months or years to learn, The accelerated intimacy born of proximity and shared danger, creating a bond that felt unbreakable, even if it was impossibly new. She learned that he was a terrible cook, but an enthusiastic helper, that he had a dry sense of humor that only emerged when he felt truly comfortable, that he was addicted to terrible reality television as a way to shut his brain off from the constant strategic thinking his work demanded. He learned that she sang in the shower badly but enthusiastically, that she was fiercely competitive about card games, that she cried at insurance commercials, but never at the things that were supposed to make people cry. At night they came together with a hunger that never seemed to diminish, as if each time might be the last, as if they were trying to memorize each other through touch and taste and the sounds they made when they surrendered to pleasure. It was different from that first desperate coupling in the hotel suite, slower sometimes, more playful other times, occasionally intense enough that they both forgot to breathe. She learned what he liked, learned how to make him lose that careful control he wore like armor, learned the particular way his breath hitched when she did something that drove him wild. He learned her body like it was a language he was determined to master, found places that made her gasp and arch and beg, took a satisfaction in her pleasure that seemed to exceed his own. They were building something between them, something that defied the circumstances that had thrown them together, and she found herself falling despite every logical reason to protect her heart. You could not fall for someone in a few days, it was impossible. Everyone knew that. And yet her heart apparently had not read the manual on what was and was not possible when it came to matters of feeling. The security updates came regularly, and they were simultaneously encouraging and frustrating, pieces of the puzzle falling into place, but the full picture remaining frustratingly elusive. They had identified several suspects within the competitor company, had traced some of the digital footprints back to hired hackers, had even discovered evidence of the reservation manipulation. But the person at the top, the one giving the orders and funding the operation, remained a ghost, protected by layers of deniability and shell companies. Alexander's head of security was confident they would eventually crack it, but eventually was not a timeline, and the longer they were in limbo, the more complicated her feelings became. Because if the threat ended tomorrow, if she could suddenly return to her normal life, would that mean this thing with Alexander ended too? Would they try to maintain whatever they had built in this artificial environment, or would they both acknowledge that it was a product of circumstances and let it fade away? She did not want to think about that, did not want to imagine going back to a life where he was not in it. But she also could not imagine how a normal marketing consultant and a billionaire magnate made a relationship work in the real world where they had responsibilities and separate lives and nothing forcing them to be together one night, lying in bed with her head on his chest and his fingers tracing absent patterns on her back. She asked the question that had been building in her for days. What happens when this is over? She felt him tense slightly, felt the pause before he answered, and knew he had been thinking about the same thing, wrestling with the same impossible logistics. "I do not know," he said honestly, which she appreciated even as she wished he had a plan, a solution, some way to make this work that her own mind had failed to produce. "All I know is that I do not want this to end, whatever this is. I know we barely know each other in the traditional sense. I know the circumstances were insane. I know there are 1,000 reasons this should not work. But I also know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and I think that has to count for something." She lifted her head to look at him, saw the vulnerability in his eyes, saw that he meant every word even if neither of them knew what to do with those words. "I feel the same way," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I am terrified because this does not make sense, and it is too fast and we are too different. But I also cannot imagine walking away from you. So I guess we are both in trouble." He laughed softly, pulling her up for a kiss that started gentle and turned hungry, and they lost themselves in each other again. Communication shifting from words to touch, expressing through their bodies what they could not fully articulate with language. And later, in that drowsy space between waking and sleeping, she thought maybe the impossible was only impossible until someone decided to try anyway. Maybe love did not follow timelines or circumstances or logical progression. Maybe sometimes you met someone in the absolute worst, most complicated way possible, and somehow it was still right, still real, still worth fighting for. She did not have answers, did not know how they would navigate the return to reality, but she knew she wanted to try. She knew that walking through that hotel room door and finding him there had been the worst thing that ever happened to her. And she knew that whatever happened next, she would not trade these stolen days for anything, because he had changed her in ways she was still discovering, made her braver and more honest and willing to take chances on impossible things. And that, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, that was worth everything. If you made it this far, you just experienced something special, a story about danger, passion, and two people who found each other in the most impossible way. But here is the thing, this is just the beginning. I have so many more stories like this waiting for you, stories that will keep you up at night, that will make your heart race, that will make you believe in impossible love. So if you want more of this, if you want to escape into worlds where anything can happen, and love conquers even the most dangerous circumstances, then hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a single story. Seriously, do it right now, because what is coming next is even more intense than what you just heard. I will see you in the next story, and trust me, you are going to want to be there.